I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today, I am honored to have with us Thomas Drake. Tom Drake is a former senior executive of the National Security Agency, NSA. He is a decorated United States Air Force and United States Navy veteran and a whistleblower. He blew the whistle on 9/11 intelligence failures, massive multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste and abuse, as well as a secret mass surveillance regime authorized by President Bush, which violated the Constitution. He is the 2011 recipient of the Ridenhour Prize for Truth-Telling and co-recipient of the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity in Intelligence Award. Tom, thanks so much for joining us today.
No, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I know this has been in the works for a while.
Yeah, we have been working on this. So, could you give people an idea what your background is in terms of your philosophical or spiritual or religious background, especially as it prepared you for having to face some of these difficult situations?
Yeah, it's sort of going into the valley of my own, shadow, as it were. I've called it the Shadowlands in terms of what I experienced over many, many years. In summary, I am a person of both deep hope and faith. Come from a Judeo-Christian background. Was nominally raised, in my family as a Methodist. It was probably, if I look back, and I've had near-death experiences, which were extraordinary unto themselves, and I'm still here. So that, I'll just say, connected me to something far greater than we can possibly imagine. And I remember quite young, I wasn't even a teenager yet. This would have been in just before, it was late 1968. You might remember Apollo 8 going around the moon and that extraordinary picture of Earthrise from the moon. And I just remember this extraordinary blue jewel hanging out in the ink of space, and it's a creation, right? I'll just say it that way. And it's something extraordinary is going on far beyond our ability to understand it as mere mortals. And so, I accept that there's some extraordinary intelligence and power that's beyond measure, and here we are. And part of my younger days was, in fact, I don't talk about it much because in some ways it's quite personal, but I was on a quest for the truth. I would say it that way, almost a mission to discover what does it mean to be alive? Why am I even here? What's life all about? It was obvious because I grew up on a farm for most of my youth, not all of it, but for most of my youth in Vermont. And you see life and death and sort of the circle of life played out, the seasons all in front of you over multiple years. And it just, it's sort of an awakening in me as to why am I here? What's it all about? But also became painfully aware, both personally and on a very negative level, what happens when power controls others for its own pleasure, abuse of power, controlling the lives of others, or holding the life in their hands and enjoying squeezing it out of them. And why are there wars? I mean, these are all these fundamental questions as to why is there suffering. And of course, during this period throughout all of this, and even decades later, the abiding faith that I have at its deepest level and its most personal is stronger than ever.
All right. So, and as we hear your story, I'll be eager to hear how that influenced you and gave you moral courage during the darkest times. So,
yeah, there is the Greek myth. The Greek myths are quite something in terms of Western. I mean, explored a lot of different religions and philosophies in my day. But if you go to sort of Greek, the Western philosophy and the Greek mythologies, even pre-Roman, you've there's a thing called Pandora's box, and we may explore what that meant to me because it's something that it's sort of like Indiana Jones, the Ark of the Covenant. What happens if you break the seal, quote unquote, or lift the lid, and things that come out aren't all that pleasant, or you run the risk of serious consequences. And in my case, and if you sort of extend the myth of Pandora's box, although it's certainly an extraordinary example, it's meant to say something. It is in some ways sort of a lesson to mankind in part. Be careful, but if you do, don't be surprised at what you see. And of course, as we know, there's a lot of negatives that come out of Pandora's box. But what's interesting about it, and of course, what's staring back at me as I'm staring into it, is a deep abyss. And yet at the bottom of the abyss lies hope. That was always sort of what I always found interesting about that is hope is at the bottom. So even when you can't see it, it's still there.
All right. Well, let's get into your story then. If you could tell us your NSA story, how you became a whistleblower, about the trial and the aftermath of all that.
Yeah, I'm still in the process of writing a book about all this, although it's been delayed several times and more recently delayed because of my health. I'm hoping to finish it up here, relatively soon. We'll see. But in summary, I was working, in the information technology management consulting field, and this goes back to the late '90s, early aughts, and used to do a lot of speaking. I went to a lot of conferences around the world, a lot of consulting in Silicon Valley. But I was also on contract. It was kind of a unique contract under Al Gore's Reinventing Government initiative at NSA. So I was not unfamiliar at all. And I even go back to my military days where I actually helped support the military side of NSA when I was in the Air Force, flying in reconnaissance missions. And we also have to recall here briefly that this is the 1990s. The internet exploded into the public consciousness. Technology, software development, apps, all just exploded. It was an incredibly rich period, a very innovative period. This is where a lot of very familiar names like Apple and Microsoft and others sort of established their roots, and then some. Internet itself, ironically enough, was actually developed in a consortium between certain universities and the U.S. government, research side of the U.S. government. What would happen, if there was a nuclear war and you needed to communicate and everything was like blown out? How do you still get the message out? And that's one of the interesting ironies of the internet age. Something has come back to haunt, especially in the surveillance, security, cybersecurity arena, of which became quite familiar. NSA was quite challenged in terms of Cold War had ended, the so-called peace dividend, if you're going back to the early to mid 90s, the irony of you always had this enemy, for 45 years, it was Soviet Union, Communist China, Cuba, North Korea, etc. But once all that sort of dissipated, particularly the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of people at very high levels is like, well, who's the next enemy, quote unquote? Another sort of George Orwell. There's always a war somewhere, right? East Asia, quote unquote. Just to paraphrase Orwell. And they were quite challenged. They did not consider internet because it was open. It didn't have any secrets worth knowing. It's like almost a direct quote. And so why bother? They were used to gathering hard secrets, targeted secrets. We call hard targets, in fact, interestingly enough. And I was well aware of that just from my background. But here I am sort of riding the wave, as it were, the crest of the internet age. And this particular role that I had, as well as others, in this sort of a reinventing government lab at NSA, separately funded, was to explore the very best in both industry and government and bring it to NSA. But NSA always had, if it's not invented in my backyard, then I don't want to be bothered, right? It's my backyard. Very insular culture in that regard. And there were concerns. I'll just share this as in summary. There was concerns that NSA was not keeping up with the digital age. Vast amounts of data, digital, not analog. NSA was used to an analog world. And even though the analog world was still there and still is to this day, increasingly most of the data was digital, and increasingly it was on networks that were fiber optic, even though traditional networks are also being used. And they were having great difficulty essentially sucking the ocean dry through a straw. I'll just sort of use that analogy. And so you're not going to get a whole lot, and no matter how fast you suck, say it that way, you're simply not going to empty the ocean. And they were attempting to basically swallow the ocean in this sea of data. And it was coming up short. And there was concerns by certain stakeholders, including oversight committees and others, that NSA was behind the times. And so it turns out that they were under enormous pressure to bring in outside hires, people that had experience, not just like me, but other systems, software engineering, information technology, financial management, program management, because in the internet age, things were definitely shifting. And a lot of the traditional mechanisms that had actually worked quite well for NSA in the past were coming up short. And so I was one of about a dozen people that were actually brought in over a several month period. And this goes back to the 2001 period. And my first day on the job was 9/11. So it's important to pause here because it's given what happened shortly after and then began to unfold at first in secret, and then obviously later, many years later, when I got indicted by the government under the Espionage Act of all things. There's what I call before 9/11, and it's not the only one, of course, because most people that have any memory will remember what they were doing on 9/11. It just happened to be my first day on the job. I had taken the oath for the fifth time when in late August, what they call entry on duty. But my actual first day, because there was all this in-processing and training and orientation and all this other different color badge for security and access. And so there's before 9/11, and then there's after 9/11. And to use a Star Trek, it's a Star Trek quote. Basically, there was definitely a tear in the time-space continuum on 9/11, and particularly with respect to the U.S., but ultimately the world. I don't think people still to this day, although obviously many, many books and articles have been published, it was clearly recognized, and not too long after it, that it really was a distinct shift of major proportions. But there's also what was happening in sort of the public arena and on the world stage, but there's also what was going on way off the stage in the deep shadows of national security and classification and secrecy. And here I am living both, right? Living both worlds, as it were. In fact, some people said I was on a suicide mission when I joined NSA because I had maximum freedom. I was doing extremely well as a principal in a boutique.com And so you're going to give all that up and the freedom and everything else to quote unquote join a highly institutionalized, highly bureaucratic, sclerotic organization that's not going to take too kindly to any attempt to change its behavior culturally. And that culture was clearly the biggest impediment. I have many, many vignettes and stories about the huge challenges. The irony, I was brought in, literally my title, even though I was not hired for the job I had formally applied for, but it ended up being a different job, but the title was senior change leader. Aha, senior change leader. Yeah. And I reported directly to the head of the Signals Intelligence Directorate. So she, at the time, was my supervisor. She reported to the highest level of NSA. In fact, during my entire time at NSA, my supervisor, was always the deputy director of NSA. So I was brought in as a senior executive. It wasn't just a junior senior executive. I was brought in at the mid-level. There's like 6 levels of senior executive in terms of the roles and responsibilities. And I had a small team at the enterprise level. And of course, 9/11 completely obliterated. And so we had, you go into crisis management mode. And then it's like a whole blur for me for like 3-4 months until I finally caught my breath during Mardi Gras down in New Orleans some months later. So right after 9/11, there was whispers, and I quickly discovered within just weeks that there was something else going on that was super hush hush. So hush hush, in fact, that even though most everybody at NSA has very high clearances, and these are clearances that require special background investigations, things, even in some cases, certain specialized compartments, as they call them, which is a very specific kind of need to know restriction for access to those specialized programs. This was super, super classified. In fact, it was so classified that you didn't even mention the name of the program because in those days, even the name of the program was classified. They would use other euphemisms to describe it, which was usually the program, right? We just call it the program. Well, it was the program. This program, in summary, and there's a whole lot about it, was to essentially circumvent the Fourth Amendment restrictions, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which ironically enough had been passed through congressional legislation signed into law by the president back in 1978 because of all of the scandals and exposures of wrongdoing and the violations of American privacy rights during all those investigations that took place in the 1970s. And of course, that's an era in which I grew up as a teenager. Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg, Watergate, Nixon. And I remember listening, right? Of course, the president ended up resigning the office of the presidency. I remember listening to the investigations and reading about them. This is the Church Pike committees, Bella Abzug, Rockefeller Commission. And it was clear that the government, even back then, in some cases for decades, had circumvented where they could get away with it under special authorities and authorizations that were in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment, which to me was given my own background and Willa's knowledge of the Revolutionary War, Fourth Amendment, besides the First, I would argue is the fundamental basis for why we had the American Revolutionary War against the British Crown and King and its colonies, right, and launched a whole separate nation. And as a parenthetical insert here, I grew up in states that were republics before they became states. So I have sort of this connection to what does it mean to be a republic. And here, Texas, Vermont were the primary states. I've lived in other republics, including, or what once were republics, including Arizona and California. uh, and of course, Vermont became the 14th state, right? But the Constitution, all the Articles of Confederation, most people forget about, were an utter failure. Out of all that came the Constitution, which didn't even have a Bill of Rights when it was, first circulated. That took a couple more years because, hey, what's going to protect us from, the likes of a King George III, even in the context of a very powerful federal or central government? So hence, the first 10 amendments was as we refer to them as the Bill of Rights. All this, is here I am now. This is 2001, and my government is under the guise and color and blanket of national security. It says, hey, basically, we're going to suspend that part of the Constitution and more, right? Because we can. And even though 9/11 was never supposed to happen, we would never again have an electronic Pearl Harbor. It did. And that's part of my whistleblowing is the 9/11 intelligence failures. So I decided I could not remain silent. And because I was senior enough, obviously I had certain protection, but I knew even then, eyes wide open, that I was extraordinary risk. Because guess what? This program, as I quickly discovered, was approved by President Bush. Obviously, significant influence from then Vice President Cheney. That started my whistleblowing. And I remember, it evolved very quickly within just weeks and months. And I remember confronting the designated attorney for the program in the Office of General Counsel. I said, what are we doing, violating the Constitution? If the laws of the land are not sufficient to meet the threat, quote unquote, there is a constitutional means by which we, change law. You go to Congress, says, well, what are we going to do? They're going to say no. I mean, I remember when I heard that, the hairs are like standing up on the back of my neck. And I elaborate in the book I'm in the process of writing with one of my attorneys. I go into much greater detail as to how this was. It was just, I could not. I mean, this is fundamental to who we are as Americans. And here, under the guise of national security, where it just doesn't matter. And I remember saying, well, it doesn't matter. If you've done nothing wrong, you don't have nothing to worry about. Well, I even then, like recalling the words of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, right? So that's where they came from. And I just, even now, I still shudder and sort of shiver at just how brazen the government was under the failure of 9/11 to keep people. And it wasn't just Americans. Remember, upwards of 300 non-Americans, foreign nationals, also perished on that day. So if I had remained silent, I would have been complicit in the subversion of the United States Constitution. And I had taken an oath. So, here I am. I mean, once again, the oath I took was central to who I am in serving the American public as a public servant. And so I was not going to remain silent. I had to defend the Constitution of the United States against my own government. I mean, imagine the prospect. So that began a multi-year set of whistleblowing activities to the point where, even though the program had remained silent, had remained secret, and let's say silent to the public, but had remained secret for many, many years until there started to be hints about something. And then there was the blockbuster article in the New York Times written by Eric Lichtblau and James Risen above the fold, upper left-hand corner, revealing for the first time the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program, which in itself was just the tip of the iceberg. I knew when that was published in December of 2005 that I would come under immediate suspicion. And the reason, and there's a whole history, remember, I'm compressing like 5 years, for a little over 4 years to be more accurate. From September of 2001, December 2005, I knew that I'd be on a very, very short list of persons of interest. I'll just say it that way, because so few knew about the existence of the program. I became very familiar with the program, early on. And I had a choice for a couple of months. I had to determine if I went public, I would be touching the third rail. I knew that by going public, I was going to put my career and even my life, liberty, at risk. I knew that. I knew what had happened to Daniel Ellsberg. And he went to trial over a 2-year period, and because of prosecutorial misconduct, broke into his psychiatrist's office, the judge threw the case out. But it had always been left hanging, like there was always sort of this, well, if we ever really have to, we could still use the Espionage Act even against a publisher, a media outlet in the future, to prevent them from publishing quote unquote national security secrets. I knew this. This is again, no naivete at all here. And if I went down that path and contacted anybody outside of authorized channels, that in fact I was really going to hoist myself up by my own petard, as it were, simply by calling. And remember, this program was approved by the president. This was not some low-level program. This was approved by the president. They had done everything in their power to protect this program from ever seeing the light of day, let alone revealing it in the public interest. Because the last thing, the reason they didn't is because it was secret, and it was super secret, and it violated the law, period. End of story. Well, if you're violating the law at that level, you're going to do everything to protect. And you're going to use the cloak of national security to do so, right? That's one of the interesting dynamics of secrecy, right? Well, it's not supposed to be used to protect wrongdoing. It's actually one of the national security rules. There's an actual executive order, but that didn't matter because it was 9/11, right? Which in itself was an excuse to further erode or accelerate the erosion of what are fundamental rights. But that's a whole nother angle, story, background, history. Always been this tension, right, between transparency and secrecy, especially in the modern era, especially post-World War II, right? Starting with the atomic age. It's really where the classification system and secrecy really kicked in. So I ended up, long story short, going to the press. And I knew as early as
Wait, before you went to the press, though, who all did you go to before the press?
My immediate supervisor, the inspector general, the attorney, the attorney, one of the principal attorneys that was in the Office of General Counsel. I actually contacted the committees.
Congressional committees?
Oh, yeah. Congressional committees. That's a whole thing in itself. This goes back to 2002. There was a subcommittee that was formed on Homeland Security. It was one of that sort of did the initial investigation as to what happened in terms of 9/11. And then there was a joint inquiry, which was a combination of both the House, ironic again, this select subcommittee formed in the late 70s to deal with providing oversight of the secret side of government. And it was combined with the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence.
Okay, and so how did all these different people respond to you, to your allegations?
It depended on who I was in contact with, but you got to remember the most senior levels of NSA, the most senior levels of the White House, especially at the president, vice president level, and others, George Tenet, Michael V. Hayden, then director of NSA, they were doing everything they could to protect the program. The last thing you wanted was to have any light of day on it. Even from the congressional committees, they didn't really inform them. And what they did inform them of, I know this because I was on the inside, let's just say shaded the reality of what they were really up to, because they were so fearful, frankly, of any kind of leak. Let's say
Okay, so you went to the press when?
In secret, anonymously. I went to the press. I would say in secret, anonymously. I went to the press in late February of 2006.
Okay.
And I began to reveal, and there was articles that actually came out, although I'm not mentioned by name, which, because of the New York Times article, right, there was a flurry of investigations by the press, not just mainstream media, but also independent media, indicating in as best they could at the time, because there wasn't much paper to show or prove, right? But that there was something not right, that there was something had been going on, and bits and pieces of this had come out over several months. And I then also contacted face to face the very reporter of record at the time, with the Baltimore Sun, about a year later. But I knew my days were numbered. Okay, I knew that by virtue of having contacted the press, although technically it was not a felony or a misdemeanor to have any contact with the press, it was considered to be an administrative violation to have unauthorized contact with the press. That's all, right? A policy level. We're not talking law. We're not even talking national security rule per se. That changed later, of course. Going to the press, obviously, when they charged me later, several years later, it was considered a felony. That's sort of wow, which still is surreal for me, right? Especially after all the other whistleblowers after me that were subsequently charged in a similar manner, right? And most of them, pretty much all of them that were fundamentally charged, ended up in prison. So I knew, as I said, April of 2006, as early as April 2000, I was under the gun, under investigation by the government as an active target, meaning, but it turned out it was clear by the time we got to the summer of 2007 that they were putting a big, huge circle around me as the primary target. I was the bullseye. And long story again, I was raided by the FBI in late November of 2007, which in itself is a day I will never forget. And that began the nightmare, the real nightmare. For the next 2.5 years, they attempted to find a way, which they ultimately did, of putting me away for many, many decades. And there's a whole lot I just skipped over, but I ended up I resigned from NSA in the spring after cooperating with the FBI across 3 different meetings, which in itself was an interesting experience, and that's an understatement. When it became clear that they were going to indict me, I stopped cooperating. I ended up hiring, at great expense, $500 plus an hour, a criminal defense attorney, just so I didn't have to deal with the government directly, but also to at least increase, even albeit slightly, the odds that I could survive, right, and remain free. But I knew I was behind several 8 balls in terms of national security um, coming down hard on me because I had, violated this fundamental tenet. You don't speak out of turn. You remain silent. It's not your job to expose national security, even if we're doing wrong, which I just could not, I couldn't countenance that, right? I just sort of this lawlessness under the rubric of as if the rule of national security would trump the primacy of the law. Remember, the fundamental basis of law in the United States is the Constitution. That's where everything else flows from there. But it didn't matter after 9/11. It was pretty clear, right? And here, I think the government in some ways gave themselves an excuse to completely, what guardrails? We don't need guardrails. I mean, it doesn't matter what Jefferson said about the Constitution and, chaining government down, right? Using that phrase. Because of sort of and this gets sort of, well, I am not unfamiliar with the history of humankind. I am not unfamiliar with the human condition. I am well aware from many, many, I'm talking seminal texts, including the Bible, but as well as other books that describe sort of the dark heart of man, right? I'm all too familiar with that, both personally and professionally. And what happens when hearts are corrupted, where power goes to people's heads and they enjoy ruling over others, right?
So what happened in the trial then? And
so
particularly your defense, like, hey, I'm trying to uphold the Constitution here. How was that received in court?
It didn't matter. It didn't matter. In fact, the government did everything it could to preclude any kind of defense based on First Amendment, based on classification, based on whistleblowing in particular. They attempted. Now, I ended up having an extraordinarily fair judge. Right? He knew that I still had fundamental rights as a criminal defendant. So when they indicted me in April of 2010, I knew I also had to find a way, not just through criminal defense attorneys, but I ultimately was declared indigent by the court at the point I was indicted because I had run out of money, right? I'd already spent a whole lot of my liquid assets, and I was facing upwards of $1 million to defend myself prior to the trial, right? $1 million. Well, here I am with public defenders now, right? Because I was declared indigent, and these are the Maryland public defenders. But I knew I had to find a way to defend myself in the court of public opinion. It'd be crucial because most, as it turned out, and I knew this, but then I experienced it. But I was certainly familiar with Ellsberg's case. I mean, that was sort of the closest parallel to what would happen, not just the trial itself, but pre-trial, that most of the hearings would be sealed, that most of the hearings would involve national security and classification. And so when it's at that level, they're not open to the public. They're sealed hearings, right? Very few people are authorized to be there, including court personnel. Only specialized court personnel that are read in, as it were, or have the necessary clearance, at least temporarily, could even be there. So besides the defense team and the prosecution. And so I ended up, this is shortly after I was indicted, reading an extraordinary op-ed that was written by Jesselyn Radak, who herself was a whistleblower during the early Bush years, dealing with what it turned out to be another, state secret, but not as secret as the surveillance program, the torture regime. Enhanced interrogation techniques equals torture. Now, I know that because of my specialized SEER training in the Air Force before I went overseas, in which they would actually not just simulate under controlled conditions. We actually we were on the receiving end of those enhanced interrogation techniques, including waterboarding, So I knew when all that came out, and I was at NSA, that was torture, clear and simple. It was not enhanced interrogation. They had basically corrupted, bastardized the program, which was how do you resist those techniques? How do you resist torture? To be more accurate, it's not about how do you then use it to torture, quote unquote, those you declared enemy combatants, right? Which is another
Right.
weird thing that came out of all this. I mean, this is all mixed in together, okay? But I knew, so I ended up contacting her. Long story short, she ended up representing me, was the lead attorney, provide counsel, advice, as well as was the point person for any and all media contacts. Because, see, during this period pre-trial, anything I said was impeachable. It could actually be used against me. And so I couldn't actually say anything on the record because the government would quickly use it. And I was already bad enough straight, right? I haven't even told you, the personal cost, losing friends, and your social networks are completely blown out. I almost lost my marriage. All of that is just, you talk about the sacrifice of a whistleblower, especially at this level, was extraordinary. This is, I mean, I know what the 1,000-yard stare is. Wondering as your life is hanging in the balance in its most literal sense, the government can literally deprive you of life and liberty. That's what I was facing. And so for 14 months, it was an extraordinary, I have to say, this face-off between myself as a criminal defendant against the full power of the government and the Department of Justice wanting to make an example of me, burn me, and put me in prison for many, many years. And so I'll accelerate all the way forward on the eve of trial, literally. So the jury had already been selected. They're being, as they call it, sequestered. There was alternates to the jury pool. This was on a Thursday prior to the Monday where they go through the formal selection process for the jury and begin the trial. And ironically enough, it was effectively on the eve of the start of the publication of the Pentagon Papers. In fact, Ellsberg, who I had gotten to know quite well during this period, Justin Radak actually introduced me to him, although I knew him from 40 years earlier. With that, all the ordeal that he went through, he was going to be if trial had actually started, had planned on flying out to the East Coast from his home in California. And unfortunately, he passed away recently. But he was going to fly out, stand on the courthouse steps in downtown Baltimore, the federal district courthouse steps, and explain to people or anybody that wanted to hear, both citizens and passersby and the press, why what was going on inside the courtroom was so critical to the future of what it meant to be a constitutional republic and the First Amendment, and calling out wrongdoing, right, of the government. So it turned out on a break late in the afternoon, and there's a whole lot behind this, right? They had already begun to, they were losing, I'll just say this, they were beginning to lose their original allegations against me based on the 10 count indictment, 5 under the Espionage Act, obstruction of justice, 4 under, there was 4 counts of making false statements to FBI agents, basically, which were false in themselves, interestingly enough. And they had already approached my defense team about entering into a plea agreement, but the plea agreement that accelerated over the weekend and the days of that week, the following week, were, we want the defendant to plead out as a criminal, and he has to be in prison for at least a couple of years, at least. And I refuse, as I said, I'm not going to plea bargain with the truth. sort of a famous statement now, or infamous statement that I made during this period. That's the last thing I was going to do. There was enormous pressure, though. You can imagine all these years. It's now 2011. I mean, I had been under the gun for 5 years now from the government, and then some. Enormous pressure. It's like this extraordinarily heavy millstone, which I kept piling things on top of it, was weighing me down, and I can't even begin to tell you what that felt like. And enduring that, and keeping and staying and still standing, right? Still standing while they're punching you at the same time, and not fall down. And there was an opportunity on my terms, as it turns out. The government has actually framed this differently, but on my terms, because the only terms I was willing to even consider at that late an hour was, they already knew this, acknowledging, that I had gone to the press, right? So they had to remain within the criminal code, the U.S. Code 18, the Title 18. So we found something in the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA, where I would simply acknowledge and accepted exceeding authorized, not unauthorized, but exceeding authorized use of a government computer. Misdemeanor, 1 year probation, 240 hours of community service, and I went free. And I interviewed about 3.5 veterans from World War II to the present day as of 2011, 2012. Extraordinary interviews. They're all out at the Veterans History Project with the Library of Congress. And I can't even begin to tell you. And I pause for a moment because it's still emotional. I haven't talked about this in a while. What does it mean to face down 35 years is what I was looking at, 35 years in prison, or even 20 is at one point, or 10 or 8 or 4 or 2, and it became none. I can't even begin to tell you how precious freedom and liberty and the right to live the life you choose as a human being, right? I can't be, it's still challenging for me as much as I can frame words. Words themselves are just symbolic, right? But sort of the deeper meaning of all this, what it means. I mean, you come out of the Shadowlands, right, into the light. I mean, it's like, wow. It took about a year or so to recover from sort of there were after effects of just, wow, prevailed. Yeah, it was quite something.
But they still took away your pension, even only for a misdemeanor.
Well, the reason I don't have a pension is because I hadn't quite served enough time between my military time, which is significant, upwards of 15 years. If you combine my active duty Air Force with my reserve time in the Navy as an intel officer, combined with I did have a short stint at the CIA, combined with my 6+ years at 6.5 years at NSA. I would have had to have served, which is a huge amount of money. It's upwards of 70,000 plus a year that I would have seen if I had stuck around, which I had planned on doing until I'd served my country across about 22 to 23 years of service, combined. That didn't happen.
Okay, I see.
And I became persona non grata. There was because even though I didn't lose my clearance, they suspended it. And it was pretty clear, I won't go into the details, there was no way anybody was going to hire me. And who wants to bring on a whistleblower, right? They might blow the whistle again. So I ended up wage grade employee at Apple for 13+ years.
13 years you were at the Apple store.
That was the longest I worked at any one place. Yeah, it was 13+ years before my health began to suffer.
Okay.
And I think my health, in part, I will acknowledge, I don't talk about it, but I think my health was in fact severely impacted by what I went through. Okay. I don't normally
Stress has
talk
a
about it
profound effect, of
because I'm an
course.
extraordinarily strong person, but I am aware of others, what they have suffered that they don't talk about, won't write about, or only in private will even share. It is profoundly negative in terms of its impact on your health and well-being. Okay. When you either face prison or you end up serving, it's a weird say you served, your sentence in prison, it it doesn't help your well-being very much. It's extraordinarily challenging. And I've known of many, many whistleblowers who quietly disappear, right, from life because that's really the only way they can handle what happened to them, or they compensate through other means. So, I mean, I'm semi-public. I don't have a problem. I'm not in demand like I was, especially when Snowden, hit, because remember the metastasization of the surveillance regime in the United States grew by leaps and bounds and was legalized, which is ex post facto, which in itself is a violation of the Constitution. You can't legalize what was patently unconstitutional, but they literally did that. And of course, the irony is I was actually indicted under the Obama administration, not Bush. Okay. Even though it started under Bush, it was a holdover. How do you know? It's
So, what have you been doing in terms of your activism since then? Since that day when you found out you're free?
Yeah, other than sort of recovering and restoring my life, I do write. I've written any number of articles over the past 10 plus years. I've given talks. COVID sort of interrupted all that, but I speak at various fora. There's a progressive organization that I periodically write for, just in terms of things that are in the news, like Trump, et cetera, or surveillance, or the reauthorization of Section 702 of FISA, which is causing both sides of the aisle, interestingly enough, because of abuse by FBI in particular, although the source of the abuse actually ends up with NSA based on the original data sets. But be that as it may, I also quietly support whistleblowers or potential whistleblowers who come to me for advice and counsel. And so in that regard, I'm an activist, but I've said this any number of times, you saw that in my little bio, I've dedicated the rest of my life as a result of what I went through in the horrific ordeal to defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, our fundamental rights. Those are some of my favorite words from the Declaration of Independence.
Okay, good. So let's get more into now what's actually has been going on in the surveillance world. So what was the nature of surveillance before 9/11 and then after?
Yeah, see, 9/11...
Beyond what you've already mentioned.
The surveillance of American citizens.
American citizens, yes.
Was extremely limited, and it's with some exceptions, right? And there's executive orders that govern this. 12-333. There's an executive order that govern. It's sort of a super secret. The interpretation of it is super secret under Reagan. Leaving that aside for the moment, okay, which in essence became the basis for, let's just go whole hog after 9/11. FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed and updated 5 times since 1978, was the fundamental basis. How do you violate a U.S. person, which can be a U.S. citizen, a foreign national that's in country with papers, or people realize is a U.S. corporation. And that's worldwide, by the way. It's not just geographical boundaries. That was what was the law. So there's some exceptions under Executive Order 12-333, which turns out are became the basis for expanding the secret side of surveillance and then some after 9/11. But that was the basis. But FISA was essentially just ignored after 9/11. And so they passed a series. The Patriot Act was one. Later, there was a couple of others. Protect America Act was a prelude. This is 2007 when things started coming out. This is well before Snowden, coming out about warrantless wiretapping. It was an attempt to legalize or provide cover for what was patently unlawful. And then you had the FISA Amendments Act, kind of an awkward FISA Amendments Act, FISA with two A's after it if you abbreviate it. That was passed in 2008. And that includes these special sections that one of them is up for renewal because there was these caveats that were applied, and it had that particular section, because it was so intrusive, it was essentially, we need to have unfettered access to anybody that's threatened in the U.S., but it's also been used as a backdoor, unfortunately, to collect, and I'll just say it this way, as sort of under the cover of 702, look at Americans that might be suspicious, okay? And that could be for political reasons. It could be for other, I don't like them, I don't like you. This is where surveillance becomes a tool of power, and it's too easily abused. They tried to put it back in the box back in the 70s. And of course, 9/11, this is why I say back in the box, Pandora's box, wide open, in secret, right, after 9/11. The oversight committees are essentially captive, I would just say captive entities of the national security establishment. I have to say it that way. I mean, you've heard a phrase like deep state. Unfortunately, that phrase has been taken way out of context. I think one of your questions, it's like, is everybody corrupt in the government? No. Okay, they're not. There's still extraordinarily, but you don't shake the foundations of power, especially when they're abusing the power, without consequences. And most people don't speak up. Most people have families. Most people have kids, kids that are going to grow up and go to college. Most people have mortgages. Most people aren't going to rock the boat. They just aren't. But surveillance has become, and we're not even talking about the special relationships that the government has with certain corporations that were very limited pre 9/11, that were greatly expanded after 9/11. It's sort of like, what's good for America, right? Well, the government says it's good for America, then we'll participate. Of course, they're not doing it for free. Let's be real about it. And so and then you just got, enormous amounts of data being collected on us all the time, right? So the Snowden revelations, which now go back 10 plus years, it's hard to believe, revealed sort of the fuller metastasization of the surveillance regime writ large, a la NSA, where, sort of based on my military background in the Air Force, the Stasi, it's just the need to know everything, right? Yeah, we need to know everything. Well, because in today's age, it's just way too seductive. I'll use that word. When you can get access to data by hook or by crook, or through partnerships, special relationships, your foreign buddies that are your equivalent, why not? Okay. Seems like every day I read some new revelation about some other relationship in which they use as a cutout to gather information that normally would have to have a warrant. And so what you're increasingly seeing, just to summarize, is instead of the Fourth Amendment standard, it's now just become, if it's national security related, we can get it. It's not even like Is it reasonable? It's even gone beyond that, right? If reasonable suspicion was considered sort of the updated standard, now it's like, hey, we can get access to the data. It doesn't matter. Yeah, and then you get this weird third-party doctrine that was sort of introduced with the Patriot Act, which, well, it's not your data anyway. It's business. Yeah, it's business. And so you don't actually own it. Then who are you then? Is it you just a pile of data? And well, this gets back to sort of, you have to remember, even in 1984 with George Orwell, which was his pen name, Wilson, he knew, even when he was out of the range of the cameras, right, which was basically the corner of his room, that means they knew where he was, right? But it's fully embedded. I mean, you don't have to. Every phone is a tracking device by definition. So it's very difficult in today's age to, quote unquote, live off the grid. Some people have attempted it. You can barely even connect with society. Now, is some of this actually legit? Yeah, of course it's legit. I don't mind, even on Amazon, I don't actually mind them offering up suggestions. Oh, we see that you purchased this, this, and this. Maybe you could consider that. And I might not have known about that. Okay. On the other hand, you can, as a dossier of data, you can compile a tremendous amount of information and reconstruct at least a digital version of that person's life. And that raises some really serious questions. I used to do an exercise with people when I was more on the lecture, conference, university circuit. And usually it didn't matter, small audience, large audience, conference room, or an auditorium. And it was called my privacy exercise. And I would get to a point in the privacy exercise where they would actually say, no, you can't. Meaning I would actually just ask, hey, for the purpose of the exercise, but turn over your keys, turn over your accounts, turn over all of your cards, turn over all your passwords. People didn't mind as much when it came to sort of the commercial side, what you would say more public, things like public records. Public records, they didn't mind. I mean, you can find out a lot. People can find out where I live very easily, right? There's even companies now that cater to that. But when you started talking about the keys to your car, the keys to your house, or digital, but physical keys, still around, or the passwords of your personal accounts, people started to draw the line. And then when you say, well, why is that? Because my promise was in the exercise is I would keep these in a special lockbox that only I would have the key to it, which has been the government argument, right? Even when it comes to encryption, right? They'll only use it in limited ways, but they will only be held by the government, right? Which is like the authority, quote unquote. You get in this whole thing about who's the authority, right? And I say, well, then, why won't you? This is a special lockbox. We're protecting it on your behalf, right? You don't have to worry about security. Well, they said, no, that's mine. And as soon as they said mine, that means there is something about privacy that's crucial to who we are as human beings. It means something. It's the integrity of our very essence, right? That gives us who we are as life as individuals. And we do have fundamental rights. And yet it's those rights that are under enormous pressure and assault right now, because it's not just control, right, of multiple types of control, but it allows those in power to see into the lives of others. And if you have that power, and I know what that's like from my time in intelligence, it is extraordinary to be listening in on the conversations of others. Although when I was in the business, it was highly controlled. You couldn't just listen in on anything. But then after 9/11, it's like, because the overseas it didn't matter. They're not Americans. We've got carte blanche, right? Well, that's what, and I believe in part in terms of culture was, well, if they're not doing anything wrong, they don't have anything to worry about.
So, what particularly then would the NSA or other agencies do with this information? I mean, what information are they getting, and then what are they doing with it that people would find objectionable?
Just about everything there is to know about you being collected, or having access to it through corporate data brokers, et cetera.
But I thought, like for phone calls being monitored, they're not actually recording the content of the phone calls.
Yeah,
They're
they don't need to.
recording the time that it happened and to
Yeah,
who.
that's been the argument. The metadata, they call it metadata, but I would argue that metadata is the index to the content. So you can tell an awful lot about what's going on just from the metadata. I've argued the metadata itself is protected. They have argued differently, right? That was partly, this is what I call the requirements creep of national security. You push the boundaries, so you say metadata, but the metadata is an index to the content.
But then
But
what
you
would they
can,
do with it?
oh, it's social network analysis, how often, when, under what circumstances. You can derive an awful lot of knowledge about a person's life. Remember, most people are not enemies of the state. Most people, by far, the vast majority of people are not threats to the state. In fact, multiple hearings, even in Congress, with all these secret surveillance programs, how many actually ended up, like when it came to Americans, right? For all the expense and the violation and everything else, it just the amount. See, part of it was we might miss something. See, part of the excuse was we need access to as much data as possible in case there's something we might miss. Look, even in the business I was in, we didn't quote unquote suck the air dry of electronic emissions, right? Technically you could. Now you can pretty much do it and store it. This is part of the march of and tyranny of technology. It allows massive quantities of data to simply be stored in case you need it later.
So, isn't one of the major arguments, though, that they're collecting this data to fight terrorism or to deal with crime? Yes, but
Yeah,
also to
all
deal.
legit. Well, it's legit to do that, but how much do you need to actually, in essence, find the bad guys? I'll just use that phrase loosely. You don't need to take it all. I mean, I didn't go into this, but systems are being developed in the digital age, right? That focused on the critical information. And you didn't need to go out, multiple, as they call it, multiple, you didn't, levels. You didn't have to go out much more than about 2 steps or so removed to what they call, to maintain or access information about potential. And if you ended up running across like an American citizen or the equivalent, right, or a national protected by U.S. law or U.S. corporation, you encrypted it. I was involved in that at a technical level, right? In fact, we developed an extraordinarily robust system that did not, it was sampling, right? You were doing sampling on massive amount of data. Most of it you never cared about. You just didn't. Even in my day, in the analog era of intelligence collection, to quote unquote maintain the peace, I'll say that in quotes, as part of the U.S. military, right? But it's providing support to national security. We didn't collect everything. It was a waste of time, literally. In fact, you drown in your own data if you just collect too much without context. You don't need to. Not everybody's bad. I mean, it's interesting that part of the culture here views everything as potentially or actually suspicious as a default. It's not about whether it's protected or not. It's whether or not we can get access to it because they might be hiding something. it's a flip on really what does it mean to know something about somebody, right? But when you have people in secret knowing something about others, it's important that they're not just collecting information and storing it or keeping it. Now, what they started put into place, in particular with the Snow revelations, it was certain other controls. You couldn't keep the data forever. There were I will admit and acknowledge there were certain, albeit modest, attempts to sort of wrestling back some of these abuses of surveillance power. Remember, it's an enormous power. I mean, this is the state. I'm well aware of what happened to me, right? When I became a target. I know what it's like to live in a surveillance society at the worst, right? Here I am in America, and I'm being surveilled over many, many months, physically and electronically. It's not pleasant at all. And then it became very obvious when they start following you around, keeping track of where you are, where you're going, where you're driving, all that. It's,
But that was all just harassment, right? That wasn't so much.
Part of it is, but they're also attempting to connect you, right? Because they're now treating you as an enemy of the state. They're now treating you as a threat to the national security state. Therefore, they're going to be justified. And they did go to a judge. They made the case with a judge, but they had to go to a judge to get a warrant. That was still the case in my case. I can't quite say that with everybody else. That's become much looser, right? Much looser in terms of the warrant requirement. You would think that it was pretty rigid with exceptions. FISA provided exceptions. If you thought someone was really up to no good as a U.S. person, corporation, foreign national, protected by U.S. law, or a U.S. citizen, you could do what was called they called it hot pursuit. But you still would have to go back to the judge, which was a secret court. It was a compromise, right? Housed in the Department of Justice. Kind of weird because it's not really it's like sort of third branch of government, but it's inside, right? The second branch. I mean, it's like, wait a minute, how could that be? Right? Okay. All right. So it's a house.
But it's something at least.
It is something, right? And there's actually an appeals court, a secret appeals court, and they have rotating judges. Remember, the government abused all that, and then after 9/11 bypassed it. But even under FISA, the original FISA updated 5 times to keep up with the technology. That's another thing. It's like, oh, the old FISA was too. No, it wasn't. They actually updated it periodically over what, a 23-year period before they said, we don't need it anymore. It's in the way. That's what I would hear. It's in the way. It's antiquated. It's in the way. I even hear about the Constitution. The Constitution was this antiquated document. Antiquated documents, the fundamental basis for what it means to be an American. If you don't have that, then who are we, right? Just speaking in terms of being an American. I realize we're a land full of contradictions, right? I get that. Even the Constitution had contradictions in it. But
all right, so
get your
as far as being a whistleblower, what do we have in place as far as whistleblower protection? And is that so-called protection, is it actually set up to protect and empower whistleblowers, or is it sometimes, in fact, used to stop them?
It's often used to stop them, especially in national security government. Because if you use the channels, which I did, you're exposing yourself. And depending on the level of wrongdoing, they're not going to take too kindly, and there's going to be a blowback. That's an unfortunate consequence, meaning the blowback you're not supposed to get blowback, but there's no teeth to preventing the blowback. There's no penalty, as it turns out. So in essence, you're penalized for whistleblowing. I won't even go in. I mean, there are on the books military acts. There are in national security. There's certain whistleblower protection enhancement acts. There were executive orders that were issued equivalent. Corporations because of the way certain corporations, what they have to abide by in terms of reporting, et cetera, like SEC, you hear about whistleblowers. There's one, I used to work at Booz Allen. There was a financial analyst who got like $40 million for massive, basically fraud committed by Booz Allen against government. Now it was civil. They didn't admit to any wrongdoing, but they did pay a massive fine of close to $400 million. She got a percentage of that. Uh, so, but in my case, it was billions on the part of the whistleblowing that involved massive fraud, waste, and abuse. But of course, I didn't see anything, right? I mean, if anything, I was effectively turned indigent, by the government after they indicted me. It's a penalty for having blown the whistle. So it depends on where you are. There's probably better protections, even though you're going to get hammered. And you've heard, there's a number of cases in the last few years where they end up having to probably leave the corporation, but at least they get their due, as it were, whether it's in Congress or through other mechanisms. National security, oof.
So do you think now, is it better now, would you say?
I wouldn't call it better. However, though, there's, especially under Biden, there appears to be, now we're 2.5 years plus into his administration, less sort of this relentless pursuit of national security whistleblowers and just hammering them that happened under Obama and Trump. There doesn't appear to be the same intensity. And I think in part because they've put in certain protections at the Attorney General level, DOJ Attorney General, when it comes to quote unquote sussing out sources or threatening reporters. That's another dynamic that occurred. Just talked to James Risen, who, I've gotten to know him pretty well, but as a result of what happened to me. In fact, they thought that I was the source for that New York Times article. That's one reason they came after me. I never had any contact with the New York Times during that period at all. It was only the one reporter and it was the Baltimore Sun. That was it. Now, did I have contact later off the record? Yes. Okay. And later on the record, yes. But at the time, no. I mean,
Well, that's what's especially frightening is there are people within the government that are trying to make the press into criminals for publishing stories. So that's especially disturbing.
Well, so here's an interesting dynamic. There's what's called access press. So you do have a set of reporters, particularly on the government beat, particularly the national security beat, who are given, in essence, special access. So in essence, the government gets to control or feed them what they want the public to hear. And reporters often, when they're given that kind of access, right, either directly or indirectly, they don't want to jeopardize their source. I had to live with the reality that when reporters writing about me, which is so weird when I say it that way, writing about me they would often defer to whatever the government was saying. They would just they would parrot it back to me as if it were true, like not even considering it's the government that obviously had an incentive to paint me in as poor a light as possible and getting themselves off the hook. I mean, in part, it's sort of this weird power projection, right? We can protect ourselves because we're in power, you're not. In fact, we did everything you do to strip you of whatever powers you had, even as a senior executive. But why would a reporter? Most will not jeopardize that. If you're independent, and this happened, there's a number of cases. Talk to James Rosen. He did not know it, found out later, they were monitoring his communications. I mean, this is blatant violation of the First Amendment. Blatant. Why would the government do that? What's the government afraid of? See, the interesting power is always afraid that it's going to be exposed, especially when it's abusing its power. That's why power is, Lord Acton, to paraphrase Lord Acton and
right.
What he says about power. Power does tend to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's why was I so dedicated to defending the Constitution against my own government? I could see the trend lines were not good. What would be the both unintended and intended consequences of removing the guardrails of our special form of democracy? The rise of authoritarianism, I'll even say it, fascism, in various guises and shapes, both open and behind the scenes. I mean, you see what's going on. You know, I shake my head. Democracy is probably the weakest form of governance, but it's still to this day, short of some benevolent theocracy, to say it that way, short of that, it's probably the best form of government, assuming we, the people, accept enough responsibility for themselves and being
Right.
responsible for who they are. If not, don't be surprised that there's going to be people who are looking to have power over others or simply seek power for power's sake alone.
Okay, well, that leads me to something you've talked about a little bit, but the moral culture at places like the NSA or DHS or CIA,
Sure.
something I think I heard you say before, it's all these people go, oh, yes, the Constitution is so important and we need to abide by this. But when it comes down to something, they go into a different mode of thinking and how they justify doing things or not doing things. So could you address the moral culture there?
Well,
And
I realize I'm taking it slightly out of context, but to me, you shall know them by their fruits, right? So I realize that's a biblical phrase, but you should know them by their fruits. Just look at the actions. Forget the words. What are the actions? The actions reveal who they really are. They reveal character. They reveal intent. They reveal either integrity or lack of integrity. I mean, remember, the only thing I had left was my integrity, simply because I was defending a piece of paper, which is the fundamental basis for our form of governance in this country. Period. Federal and state. Right? States have their own constitutions. Why do we have those constitutions? If rule of law doesn't matter, then don't be surprised that you end up increasingly in a lawless environment. Well, then that's where the strong man, that the authoritarianism, autocratic policies begin to hold more sway than not. Democracy is messy. I'm the first to acknowledge it. But you're about to say, sorry, I want to make sure I answer your question. Sorry.
But isn't it the case that the people, so many of the people, the rank and file in those agencies aren't so much malicious.
No.
They want to work 40 hours and be able to go home at night to their family and have weekends off and not have conflict in their life, not get stressed out like you.
A job is a job. I will be the first to tell you that. I've worked with a lot of good people, and there's still many good people quietly doing their duty for the American public in secret. They're not going to rock the boat. I had many people tell me privately that they understood why I blew the whistle. In some cases, they supported me privately, but the last thing they were going to do is go public. The last thing they were going to do is going to say anything about it, even when they knew certain things, because of the price they would pay. So yeah, it's, then you get into sort of institutionalism. It becomes your 9 to 5, and I'll say that 9 to 5 could be shift work, wherever it is around the world or even the U.S. It just becomes, another job that happens to be secret, and you did in fact give up certain rights. It is true that you're under one of the ironies, you're under more restrictions. I think there's a higher obligation. If you're that in the secret side of government, which has very little oversight, as it turns out, to me, you have a higher obligation to ensure you're on the straight and narrow when it comes to this. It doesn't give you the excuse to hide behind secrecy, to do whatever you feel like it. But unfortunately, there is a significant vein that runs through the national security establishment, which that's exactly is what can we get away with? And because it's secret, we use secrecy to protect what we can get away with. And this is particularly true post 9/11. remember, it's what's the shift. To me, there's this real shift to more of this sort of the amoral, as if morals ever matter, but this sort of this amoral environment in which it's whatever, we support the mission, but then you have this element, not everybody, of course, but you have this element that is receiving orders, right? And even if they're unlawful, we're still going to do them. Or we'll find ways to make it lawful or legal, to be more accurate, make it legal, but in an unlawful manner, as I was discussing earlier. And that really concerns me, because that means you're just playing the system. You're gaming the system. You're weaponizing the system. And to me, it's cui bono. Who benefits? Never forget, what's the fundamental question always? Who benefits?
Okay. So what is going on with Congress now in terms of surveillance, any laws or acts they're working on passing, or et cetera?
The big one, well, there is one that's caused a lot of controversy, and both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, have been very vocal in the need for reform. It's not about doing away with Section 702 or the FISA. It's about reform. And the question now, because the government's pushing back, Biden administration pushing back hard, they simply want an upvote with no changes, because they want maximum flexibility. They don't want to have any constraint. That's part of the problem. The irony, of course, is they are constrained by the Constitution. It's like, do we have to have this proxy infrastructure? Like somehow the proxy infrastructure that you place that makes it this sort of the rules, right? That somehow that substitutes? Of course not. It's back to the fundamentals. But that's really the only controversy right now. I have to say that. All the rest, right, is deferring to the executive and just assuming the good people will not get any more carried away than they already are. Surveillance is here. Surveillance is embedded. Certain controls are put in place, but I don't think, I even wondering now, because it's now September, that because it's basically a sunset clause, 5-year sunset clause for the Section 702 in particular, that it's just going to be, you know what, we're just going to kick it down the road, the surveillance can down the road another 5 years, and we don't.
So when do the 5 years end?
End of the year.
Okay, so that's going to be a congressional vote.
Congressional, because that's part of the law. It was sunsetted. It was not a permanent thing on purpose. It was attempted originally to be temporary. I don't argue. Right. I don't disagree.
Does it have to? Right. Does it have to pass by just a bare majority or 2/3?
It's the standard process. It'd be the standard. Yep.
Okay.
Simple majority.
Okay. The end of the year.
Up or down.
Are there any others besides that? Anything else going on that's relevant?
There's nothing I'm aware of other than, there's always, like, I'll call it lobbying loosely, where attempting there were some efforts, not so much lately, but in the last few years, efforts to reform or do away with the Espionage Act, because the government is using it as a bludgeon, as a cudgel, and have been increasingly. Less so under Biden, right? I will qualify that, but just the use of the fact that it's now become normalized. If we decide we want to use it to go after somebody because they quote unquote violate a national security rule, then we'll do so. Remember, there are real national security cases, and there are, criminals, and there are real Espionage Act cases. For me, it's surreal that Trump was charged on the Espionage Act, because he held umpteen thousands of pages of documents, many of which are highly classified, that he had no business keeping at Mar-a-Lago. In fact, he was under additional restrictions. The Presidential Records Act specifically said NARA retains any and all presidential records. He doesn't get to keep any of them. And there's a whole protocol for that. But I don't think they ever anticipated someone like Trump just taking them. And yet, so Espionage Act has become, which was it's like, see, when I was charged in the Espionage Act, you must have done, I mean, I had family. You must have done, what is it, Tom? If you did the crime, do the time, because not everybody gets charged in the Espionage Act. That's true. That was certainly true. I was only the fourth American who'd been charged for quote unquote non-spy activities, traditional spy activities, non-spy. And first whistleblower since Ellsberg. But then a whole boatload of people followed after me.
Right.
Across two administrations.
So how about with the U.S. Supreme Court? What's their involvement been?
With surveillance or with, they've demurred. I'll use that word loosely. Demurred, meaning there's been attempts to even bring, there is one person who, he was an air marshal who ended up in the Supreme Court. And he had blowback because of it. He's really the only one to date. And that was simply it wasn't Espionage Act. It was public safety, which was part of his whistleblowing, right? And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they found favor in his case some years ago. Although he's paid a very, very heavy price for it. They actually retaliated against him a second time when they came back to work because he had won his case at the Supreme Court. Now, they've never taken on a national security Espionage Act case because it opens up a huge can of worms. I think because it's national security, they again demur to the executive branch.
Okay. So finally, what can we do as individual citizens, as churches, faith communities? I know there's civil liberties organizations out there. So what can we do?
Well, I tend to be a proponent of what some have referred to as Jeffersonian democracy. Jeffersonian had his own contradictions, right? One of the primary principal authors of the Declaration of Independence. He was also a slave owner holder. So but he wasn't the only one. There was a contradiction back in those days. But leaving that aside for the moment, again, historical context is critical. If you look at at the beginning of the Constitution, the preamble, it's we the people. To do what? In order to form a more perfect union. So it comes back to us. It really does. And I do hold we the people responsible in the end for the direction of our governance structure. Because even though there's an awful lot of unelected power brokers, both in government as well as in corporations, the fact is that the core of our governance structure, both federal and state, are elected officials, and they get to appoint others. Now, it's probably true that your typical person living in the United States doesn't aspire to be a politician, quote unquote. But the fact remains, we need really good people of high integrity in offices across the land. And to the extent to which we increasingly see, even at the local level, the erosion of good people and the ascendancy of those who tend to be more authoritarian in nature for the sake of authority, then we're going to suffer as a democracy. And to me, that's where, and I do still have faith. I do have faith, although, it's not, I've always said hope is not a strategy, but I have the faith that enough people, as happened in 2020, even with all the contradictions in the Democratic Party, right? Because they are an institutionalized party, that there'll be enough people at the ballot box next year who will vote, I'll just say it, the better way, right? Doesn't necessarily it's the best way, but a better way. But I have concerns. I am certainly don't have my head in the sand when it comes to what happens if, right? I thought 2020 was, I mean, that was kind of a pucker factor in terms of it, how that evolved. But it's pretty clear to me that we cannot endure for long. I mean, if you're looking sort of at the life of a republic, and unfortunately, we have the Roman Empire, the Republic, as a Western example of what happens when it's corrupted from within. And I'll just kind of end it with this. We are not immune from history, meaning the United States of America, for all sort of the laudatory city on a hill, brighten, shining sea to sea, all that, America the Beautiful, for all that rhetoric and for all the color and pageantry and the flag waving and all that other stuff, right? Which is very much part of my background. There is no get out of history free card. There just isn't. And the fact remains that all empires, and let's look the gift horse of history in the mouth when it comes to the United States. We are an empire. Okay. We're not immune. We're just not. All empires end up in the dustbins of history. They just do. There's no guarantees. I mean, Benjamin Franklin reportedly was approached by a woman reporter, right? That's the story. What did you guys, because it was all guys, in secret, mind you, what did you guys do in there? Right? What did you create? And he said, reportedly, a republic if you can keep it. That was part of the grand experiment. Capital G, capital E. There were no guarantees. There aren't. I mean, we've been through enough in this kind of civil war. My God, I used to live in the South as well. I became extraordinarily aware that there were some people still fighting the lost cause. That the Confederacy as a Confederacy continued to have almost a magnetic pull. And of course, right, civil rights and all that means. I mean, and yet there's been a lot of progress as well. I mean, my gosh, you don't have to go back, a little over 100 years. Women couldn't even vote. Women couldn't vote. Women they weren't even counted. Slaves actually were counted in the original Constitution. Women were not counted. It's like, okay, it's like, what does that mean? So we made some progress. I don't want to see us retrograde, as a republic, but there's certain things that are moving in this country that clearly are anti-democratic. This can't be very blunt, and
both from the right and the left.
Both. It's both. It's not just a Republican MAGA thing, right? It is a concern, and then you have a certain generation, and I have to say, I'll just say it, in their 70s and 80s, late 70s and 80s, and even older, who just will not let go. I mean, it's time for them to go. I mean,
like in the Senate, you mean?
Senate, presidential candidates. Yeah, remember, part of the dynamic here. It was never intended to be a career. That's one of it's become institutionalized. You didn't go to Washington and make it a career and hold on to your seat. You just didn't. That's why from time to time, even more recently, you hear about term limits. You have term limits for justices in the Supreme Court because they're appointed for life. But you now have senators in particular, but even congresspersons who are effectively serving for the equivalent of life. Why? Because they can. Is that really? I mean, that's not to say that you can't serve your country faithfully and with integrity over many, many years. But there was a reason why it was only every 2 years, right? There really was. It is 6 years for the Senate. There was a reason. It's only 4 years for president. We didn't appoint presidents for life. We didn't appoint them for 8 or 10 or 12 years. I think there was limits placed, but once you're in office, you have enormous ability as an incumbent.
Sure.
Good, bad, indifferent. I don't know. It's just we have many challenges, and we need. There's that movie, American President, and he was accused of having a girlfriend that quote unquote, because his wife had died of cancer, et cetera, and he's president and he's running for a second term, and there's all this innuendo and rumors and everything else, and he comes out into the press room, and it's Michael Douglas. It's a movie that his statement about democracy is extraordinarily powerful. Right? It really is. Because it's not easy. No one ever said it was easy. It just isn't. You got to really want it. And I sometimes wonder how many people there is a set of people, I have to say that, who, separate from those in power, who are in a complex world, will tend to look for simple answers and simple solutions. And if someone comes along on quote unquote, the white horse, or perceived to be riding in on a white horse to save the day, I mean, that's why the rhetoric of Trump, I would just speak briefly is extraordinarily alarming, because it's the language of fascism. It's the language of propaganda. And of course, any number of politicians play that game. But I've lived and seen too much history. And here in my own country, that's part of what I've had to deal with, and I continue to live with, and it's a burden that I carry for the rest of my life. I live with the what ifs of history, but it's like I don't want to see I don't want to see our people, let alone the world. But the trend lines, there are those who don't mind engaging in violent rhetoric or worse for the purposes of and that's very concerning. We saw what happened on 6 January. That there's nothing normal about that. I don't care how much they try to make it normal. It was and that was incited by the then President Trump. It really is concerning in terms of the future of who we are. And I think I have said, I'll now end it. Sort of my finale here is with you is, what future do we, the people, want to keep?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm going to keep asking that question.
All right. Well, I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Thomas Drake. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
All right. Peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.